All right. Wow. Really, really happy to be sitting down again with Yvonne Martinez. Yvonne has been with us several times, so she's definitely no stranger to the Justice Collective world. How are you this afternoon, Yvonne? It's good to see you.
I'm doing really good. Looking forward to meet with you again today. It's always fun. Answer
Yes,
questions.
I'm really excited about this conversation. We've been doing the deep dive around addiction. Have had some really good moments with those that are recovered addicts. They've come out of that space, and really excited to talk to you. You have just hours and hours of work with those that are dealing with addiction in some form, shape, or fashion. Excited to get into some of what you're doing currently, because there's some stuff really focused on something that maybe isn't talked a lot about, and that would be sexual addiction. But before we go there, why don't you just briefly let us know your background in the addiction space?
Well, it's interesting that when I was growing up, I never wanted anything to do with addiction because actually, as I grew up a little older, every man in my family had died from alcoholism, including my dad, my uncle, my grandfather. And so addiction was something I wanted to stay really far away from because it was really painful. I think I was the first person in my family when I was 18 years old that called Al-Anon and explained to them what was going on. And they said, oh yeah, that's addiction and you're codependent. So I learned early on the terminology around addiction, but living with a family of addicts for all of my life until my mom. Well, my dad died at 52 from cirrhosis of the liver from alcoholism, and my mom was in her probably in her 50s when she got recovery and gave her heart back to the Lord. And so it was a beautiful time to have that shared time with her, even though I didn't get to have it with my dad. So with addiction, I never really wanted to be involved with addiction because it was such a personal journey for me. But then when I was really looking at pursuing more, I found out that almost every client that I was working with that had trauma had some sort of addiction in their background. So I kind of got into the working in the addiction world because I was working with trauma and finding that underlying pattern of addiction gave me, I had more, I suppose, more internal strength, personal strength, as well as knowledge to feel like I could be of a benefit to that field as well.
Absolutely. And so your context is as a therapist, a counselor, you're sitting down with individuals. What would you say, years of meeting with people, years of being in that space of meeting out healing and, being in the space of bringing transformation and strength to people that are dealing with some form of trauma, but specific to addiction, what would you say are some of the roots there? I mean, I'm sure we could talk for a long time, but you're trying to unpack and kind of deconstruct, here's addiction. Mm-hmm. And this is the hold, this is the problem.
Right. Well, I think that when we look at trauma-informed care, we find out that 90% of mental health is rooted in unresolved trauma, and 80% of addiction is rooted in unresolved trauma. So that marriage of trauma and addiction, it makes sense that when people have pain in their life, they want to find a way to get away from that. And a very easy way to get away from it is by anesthetizing themselves and putting themselves really in a state of disconnection, because the antidote for addiction is connection. And so that's why programs work where there's actually a recovery community of people that speak the same language, and they have a joint history, and they have a partnership in their future together. And a lot of the honesty and reality that's spoken between people that have been in pain is not language that the normal population really wants to hear about. So I think that the recovery community does a really great job in helping people to find the connection that they've longed for. It's just not the community that bridges every walk of life, because you usually still have immediate family, you have employment, you have children, you have careers in life, so we saw such a huge, maybe like a 60 to 70% increase in addiction during COVID, as well as 40% of increase in domestic violence. So when there's stress, whether it's interpersonal stress, community stress, worldwide, stress, it does ripple out, and we see the effects in addiction. So in the connection that I see that's probably really pivotal is that in trauma, there's levels of dissociation, meaning that when the pain and the neurochemistry levels get so flooded in the system, there are levels of cognitive disconnection with the body. And it's very interesting how the dissociation of addiction can be patterned after the early dissociation of traumatic experience. So while the body has a memory of being disconnected to avoid pain, it actually replicates oftentimes that disconnection in the life of the addict, that dissociates voluntarily in order to believe that it will help control an uncontrollable situation, only to find that partnership becomes a situation that's not controllable.
So how hard is it to enter into that connection process? I read a stat recently that only 1 in 10 individuals that need treatment for their addiction actually access it. I'm just imagining people that are anesthetizing, self-medicating, like crossing over from a place of desperation and isolation and an addictive state and entering into a restorative or healing process may not be the easiest journey.
I think it was
talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, around 2015, when I first sat in on some of our community meetings with the director of mental health for our community, and looking at what programs we had and so forth. And the statistic then was that only 16% of people ever complete treatment.
Okay.
Only 16% ever complete treatment in California. And out of that, there is a high percentage of relapse. So
Sure.
Our programs do a great job at helping people to get back on their feet. It's from that point forward that if people they can learn to manage a relapse trigger. But if they cannot manage the stress and the everyday problems that happen in their life, it is a segue to relapse. So AA is the #1 worldwide best recovery program ever invented. So it is the program that gets more people sober from whatever their addiction is. But it is, as long as you walk within the borders of that program, you can remain clean or sober. I don't know necessarily if it's true freedom.
Yeah.
And so we look at not so much what you're running to, but what you're running from. So we want to work with that person and the underlying trauma that is replicating, and how they're running from addiction. We want to look at how that is being used, and how we work not only with the spiritual realm, but we work with doing body work as well. And that means that we want to give the body a new experience of freedom, so that it has an interruption in the neurochemistry pattern. So we do some of that with prayer. We do some of it by using what we call in sozo body work, where we're actually praying for those neurochemistry paths to be to sever the harm done. We're actually doing a lot in that spiritual realm around what happens when somebody opens up their mind and their body to pharmacology and how that can affect long-term the way the brain the brain facilitates that that chemical.
And your experience, are primarily you're sitting down with individuals, or are you also working in like group settings?
We do have two groups that go on. One is we're working with some evidence-based material that was created by people who have a high success rate in recovery for both alcohol and sexual dependency, because those are the two things that we see the most problem with in working in the church setting. We're not dealing a lot with heroin or meth.
Yeah.
We are working with marijuana or some of the derivatives of that, but not as much as we would if you were working in a different type of rehab setting.
But I asked just for the sake of like, as you're with an individual versus doing group stuff, like what are you recognizing in terms of the healing process, an individual's capacity to get free, stay free? I don't know if there's like distinctions between those two settings or it's pretty similar.
Well, there is the work, of processing through what happened, why it happened, why the person acted out in the way that they did with those experiences. But I think the group setting is really where a lot of freedom takes place, because there's a loneliness and addiction that can only be bridged by connection, and not necessarily connection with other addicts, but connection in talking about truth, in talking about reality, and talking about the losses. Because people don't really get help until they start having significant loss. So only 70% of relationships where there's sexual infidelity and sexual addiction or pornography going on, only 70% of those marriages actually are salvaged. And there's 40% of sexual addiction results in abortion as well. So there's a lot of losses, financial losses over time. We saw some math problems about, if you went back 10 years, if you were a porn addict, you went back 10 years and you saw how many times you bought videos or magazines, or you bought online services, and how many times a month you did that over 10 years, it ends up for some clients being like around $60,000. And so when you go to look at the financial loss, just seems like not a lot, day by day, but how it accumulates over the years. So people get help when there's significant losses, and the pain of the loss is more greater than the pain that they're running from.
Let's talk a bit about that. So you guys are taking time, focusing, specializing in helping those with sexual addiction. You just mentioned something you guys have discovered, that like when there's loss, maybe they're more likely to see change. What other things are you learning in that sexual addiction landscape? Are there big differences between that and drug addiction, or we're talking about very similar things?
Well, in sexual dependency, there's high arousal neurochemistry going on. So people think, well, they just looked at pornography for maybe 10 minutes, but there's a whole set of connection that's going on in the brain and the body at the beginning of thinking about an image, seeking after that image, acting out with that image, post-image recovery, the euphoria, the guilt around it. And then there's a great deal of time spent in shame or getting away from shame by acting out again. So arousal chemicals are going on for many hours of the day. And what that does is it creates a dependency in the brain, just like any other good feeling. It's meant to trigger the pleasure sensation. So just like any good feeling, it becomes, you want it good all the time. And the thing about addiction is that it is it is a behavior of control. If I'm
Okay.
using this chemical or this substance, I have found a way to control areas that are not controllable in my life. So we become dependent on being controlling. And what happens is that the self eventually loses their authenticity and they become a servant to this addict portion of their life.
Wow.
The conflict between not being who you're supposed to be or other people that think that you are is where the real conflict is, that you can no longer be what other people need you to be. So the battle takes place of, which place in you is going to win. And very often the addictive part will win at that moment, because the person has developed a sense of, I can be in control. And they've really changed the relationship from intimacy to intensity. And intensity is a very compelling, curious feeling in the body. It has a lot of chemical reactions that are going on, where intimacy is really partnering with chemicals like vasopressin, which is this ability to just be at peace. We don't need a lot of adrenaline. We don't need a lot of dopamine. We don't need a lot of norepinephrine going on in our brain. We just need this place of peace. And so relationships that are monogamous and continue connecting over years find that they don't need intensity anymore. So relationships that have intensity, they have passionate breakups, passionate makeups, passionate breakups, passionate makeups, and that is all involved around high arousal, high sensations in the body. So addiction becomes a way to control the body. And the body has certain feelings, and when those feelings are being activated, they don't have to be in relationship with any person, because they're now in a relationship with this inner chemical process that's going on.
Fascinating. That is fascinating. And what are you seeing in terms of healing there? People breaking free from those cycles or coming out of sexual dependency, sexual addiction?
Well, we have a high level of success. We've only been running our real program for about, I would say, year and a half, maybe a year and 3/4 now. And well, we've been doing we've always worked in that area of sexual dependency, but just not as formally as we are now. We've been running the addiction program since 2012 in Transformation Center, working with a variety of things that have gone on with people. We had a client that came in that was addicted to Coricidin, the cold tablets, Coricidin. And they had taken so many of them that they were actually in a severe auto accident, but because this was an over-the-counter medication that they were taking, it couldn't be detected in their body. But there's a chemical in Coricidin that people make meth from. So he was actually a meth addict that was using the Coricidin tablets in order to get high. So he had taken so many of them. He was about 6'2" and weighed about 120 pounds. He was dying. The doctors told him that he's literally, if he takes one more Coricidin, he is probably not going to make it.
Wow.
It was a desperate attempt. His family flew him out, and he spent a week with us. And during that time, we discovered something rather interesting. And it is played out in a lot of the material that we have read and kind of built some of our ministry around. And that is that this particular person showed us that he had empowered this tablet to manage him. And we realized that in breaking soul ties with that chemical or that process, we actually unempowered and broke through this relationship of reciprocity. Like the person took the tablets and it served them and they got their high from it. And then the tablet withdrew and then they would take it again. So we learned about how people create soul ties and create this reciprocity with their chemical of choice, their image. Their shot of Jack Daniels will always give them what they are expecting.
Wow.
And so they learn to control their life based on the quantity, the quality of what it is that they have purchased to serve them. So when we saw a spiritual shift over that person when we actually prayed that. So we actually look for the authentic self and the addict now when we do ministry, so that we can actually disempower the addict and empower the authentic self to have their true identity.
And I mean, I don't want to oversimplify things, but it is that simple. There's something they're masking, some pain, some trauma, some heartbreak, some challenge, and somehow the addictive substances, yeah, it's feeding them, right? It's feeding a part of their soul that keeps them feeling like they're okay. They have some measure of control. So within the sexual dependency space, you said you guys have a high measure of freedom. Like you're seeing a lot of healing come to people. People are getting well, beginning to make good decisions. Anything to share there?
I think it's we try to create anywhere from 2 to 4 contacts with our client per week. We have a workbook that we're doing. We have a processing session around the workbook material that is inner healing based. So we're not just reading material, we're finding where that material speaks truth or discrepancy to them. We want to be able to bridge that through processing. We have an accountability group that we call a connect group now, so that we actually want to track all the things that they're doing good. We want to find out what's the best of them, not the worst of them. They already know the worst of them. So we want to find out who they want to be when they grow up and how we can empower those good things about them. And then we have clinicians on our team that can work with anxiety, depression. And then I do most of the trauma work with clients.
Okay. And so, I mean, that just sounds like a lot of elements. Like it's not one piece that kind of dismantles that edifice of addiction. Like you got a lot of wraparound, a lot of pieces of that puzzle.
Right. And most of our clients are, I would say, are married or have been married and are looking to get married again. And so when you have someone who has been hiding something like sexual dependency and it actually comes to light, they finally find a sense of relief, like finally I'm going to be working on this. But in telling their spouse or their family the truth, the family now receives that trauma in a different way. So oftentimes in starting recovery, couples are at different levels of healing because someone is like finally got the courage and the honesty to come forward, and the other person is like snowballing down because they had no idea that this was as bad as it is, or as there's been so much going on. So we work a lot with betrayal, and so betrayal is a different kind of trauma. It's an insidious thing that happens. It's the breach of an implied promise, and so the betrayal in addiction is sometimes more difficult to begin to heal because it violates all levels of trust.
Yeah.
So
are you often seeing those couples together, or is that typically like a separate session just with
So in those contact sessions with the client, then we also want to do couple sessions, and then oftentimes there's an individual appointment for the spouse as well. So we have females in our program as well. And currently I do all the work with our females unless we have one of our clinicians on our team that would have a specialty that we would need to refer them for. So we're building out more in our women's support groups and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. You said something earlier, like individuals that maybe have like lived in this hidden place for quite a while, and now they're making the decision to work on freedom. And what I heard you articulate was like a measure of hope there. What would you say to somebody that isn't in a cycle of asking for help or looking to break free, but they feel very stuck, and probably everything in them is like, man, I need help. I don't like where I'm at. Like, anything you can say to that individual to help them get on the road to recovery? Or
So we, in the beginning, we also, I love for my clients to do strength finders, because I want to find out the best of who they are and what their strengths are. And you and I talked a little bit about this in working with trauma, working with sex for sale. A lot of the clients that come out of that, they just don't have any hope for such a poor self-image. And for every person that stayed in a domestic violent relationship or in a sex for sale relationship, there's something about their sense of loyalty, something about their sense of even caring for others more than themselves. And so every strength that's overused can become a handicap. So we want to find out what's the best of who they are, because most people, by the time they get help, have really cut off and denied the best of who they are, and they no longer feel that their life has real value internally or spiritually. So we want to find out the best of who they are. We want to find out all the good things about them, and then we help to build in their program things that they would do. Like, we have one client that their part of their plan is that they go to the gym 3 days a week. They're very physically active. So where the body they've been using their body in unhealthy ways to produce sensations of pleasure for them, we've created a package for them that they're going to the gym, they're actually swimming, they're doing real active sports, so that it will help to give a healthy vitality to the body in a way that can be exercised that's healthy for them.
Yeah. So your message back to that individual is we want to help you discover who you are. And they're like moving towards healing can sound challenging, but there's hope. There's a sense of like, we're going to find your best self. What have you discovered? You mentioned earlier, like, when the loss is great, people will come out and ask for help. Anything else that you've discovered that helps people kind of cross that line from, again, just being stuck in their addiction and moving towards shift or change or healing?
Well, it's when the conflict of living in two worlds becomes unbearable.
Okay.
And so it could be any number of things that would happen. It could be the discovery of, from a family member or partner. But at the end of the day, the person has to begin to exchange their affection and their connection with the substance that they've been able to help control with, to what real intimacy is like, and really understanding the human elements of bonding, because relationship and community are the antidotes for isolation and addiction. But that moving into that world, especially in the Christian world, can feel pretty like it's a pretty big bridge to that place. And so that's why the groups, the connection between our clients together, they help to strengthen each other. And they also speak goodness, into each other's lives as well. And I know I'm smiling, but we have the Lord, and with God, all things are possible. And I think I wouldn't want to do this field that I'm in, either trauma or addiction, if I had to do it in a completely secular environment. In fact, I did do it in a secular environment for a while, but I found almost in every client there was a place of spirituality that I could connect with. So we are meant to be spiritual beings as well. So with where we are in our world here, we see so much hope, and I love doing assessments with people. I love kind of reading their mail and helping them to know that they're not alone, and just giving them a life preserver to the the shoreline here to get some help.
Talk more about what you see in that exchange when people are coming out and being open, and I'm specifically referring to the community dynamic where you're in groups and people that have a similar struggle are processing together. Like, what do you recognize in that setting that's powerful, that's transformative?
Well, they're not alone. They're
Okay.
not alone. So all trauma and addiction either stems from an orphan heart or leads to an orphan heart, meaning the
Okay.
person feels unloved, unprotected, not valuable. So when they find a community that values them, then real authenticity can be developed. I loved it's an attorney by the name of Andrew Bacchus. And when I was first in ministry way back in the day, and we had the centerfold was the Parade magazine, which was the news magazine inside, the Sunday paper. And the Parade magazine was all kinds of articles about, movies and stars and, current events and that kind of thing. And
Okay.
Andrew Bacchus wrote, he was an attorney that represented the most horrific child abuse cases in the United States. And he wrote several articles. I still have them in my collection of things that I used to share when I was originally speaking. And he made this correlation of that when we don't get what we needed when growing up, when we didn't get the family that we deserved or really needed, we have to then find a family of choice, not a family created by blood, but a family created by a synergy and a commonality. And it's so much what the body of Christ can do for people that come from families like I came from, where there was no real safe place. I had to find my way through. In fact, when I read things like Vander Kolk's book on the body keeps score, I was 25 years old and diagnosed with cancer and 5 years to live, because I had I just was destined to find an end to my life. Somehow my body had taken a toll on all the stress and the trauma that I had. So when I came to know the Lord, I'm 45 years cancer free. And my husband, who led me to the Lord, we're going to celebrate 43 years married on Thursday.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah,
That's
it's
amazing.
a happy dance. So I'm like living proof that you can make it, that there is hope, that God himself wants to intervene. And when we partner with him, it just changes the dynamics and it changes the outcomes.
And in that group setting, when people are making contact with other people, the thing what do you recognize that's transformative there? The acceptance, just the ability to share. I don't know, maybe it's receiving wisdom from somebody who's in a similar place, probably all of the above, huh?
Well, it's the vulnerability of the facades coming off, the perfect husband, the perfect, pastor, the perfect, the perfect employee, perfect dad, all those facades get to come off. And at the bottom, we're all created in his image, in God's image. And so that vulnerability of being able to be willing, to me, the greatest gift that my client can give me and the greatest compliment that I can have is that they really want to see me to be free. And that I honor that vulnerability. And I feel like it's the greatest gift that a client can give is the vulnerability of asking for help and for hope. So that authenticity, and then finding others' experiences in their journey to freedom. What works for one person doesn't always work for somebody else, but when new clients come in those groups, we have clients that have been discharged from the program that continue to show up in those groups that are doing fabulous in their marriages and in their careers. And they're the testimony. They're who everybody else wants to be when they grow up. They want to have those victories.
Yeah.
So it makes it visible. That possibility is really visible.
That's great. One thing we didn't go into that you mentioned earlier, I'd love to explore a little bit more, is the process of those that are impacted by someone's addiction. So you were talking about marriages specifically, could be family members, what you have seen over the years, like what you would say to family members, what you would say to spouses, what you would say to an individual that's being impacted by someone else's addiction. Any kind of wisdom. I know there's like, we could talk for hours just right there, but maybe unpacking that a little bit more.
Well, the one thing I always try to point out is that their ability to love cannot be taken from them. They hung in there, they stayed.
Okay.
And the
Yeah.
fact that they stayed probably made it more painful for them facing reality than they could have jumped ship. So the fact
Sure.
that they stayed is actually a strength that they had. The fact that they still want love and want to be loved is a huge benefit. So that couldn't be eradicated from them, partly because they're created in God's image and He is love. So we're destined to love and to be loved. And so the pointing out that, it could feel a little worse, but really so we do what's called an impact statement around maybe about 3/4 into the program. We have the spouse or the family member or the person who was harmed. We actually do an impact statement. So their material, we have material for the spouse that's written from more of a female's point of view of the betrayal, the finding, what it was like to have found, to have it be known to them that their spouse had been unfaithful or been online or hookups, whatever it might be. And so the walking through, every victim of trauma has to deny a level of truth in order to survive, whether it be a trauma in a home growing up. They know things that are going on, but they're taught to deny the truth because, like in my family, it was my family, oh, we're not addicts, but I had to deny that truth, and I knew that there was something wrong. When you live in a chaotic home, you have to deny the truth that you could be harmed at any time. So we grow up not really being honest and telling the truth. So the consequence to not telling the truth means that we partnered in that addictive process.
Mm.
So when we learn to tell our own truth and to be able to share our own experiences, it begins to set a new level of expectation from the person who is getting help. So now they're learning to speak the truth, and we can actually speak our truth as well, the partner. So the impact statement goes through the harm done. So like in restorative justice, there would be a reconciliation between the victim and the person who was harmed and the person who caused the harm. In that restorative justice, where there's a statement of impact of their experience caused by the other person's actions or behavior, then that person can make a formal apology, identifying the loss that this person received as a result of their actions. So this reconciliation then is a new reset in their marriage and in their relationship. So just like in any other addiction program, we ask for complete abstinence from sexual connection while they're up until this phase in the program. So we want to see the ugly of what's happening when they're not acting out, so that the team then can actually work on the healing process, because I'm not going to work with somebody who is under the facade of the dissociation from addiction, who's in the middle of their addictive process. It's almost impossible to get through to the person to find that hope. So my mouse is in the screen there. And so we want to have them be abstinent so that there can be a reset. And then we want to actually tutor them on what sex is meant to be. what was the God originated sex between two people that are married and are in love? And so what does it mean then to have a whole sexual relationship? And so every spouse who's been with somebody who has been addicted in pornography knows that they don't get all of that person in their marriage bed. There's a portion of that that can't come to the table and be intimate the way that the partner would like. So there's the rebuilding of that sexual connection based on a new level of honesty and trust.
Yeah. And I would imagine like there's phases for those impacted by addiction, phases of recovery for themselves, like phases of acknowledgement, phases of acceptance, anger, probably some real hope and joy that the person that's been addicted is actually moving towards health. But it sounds like there's a process for them, just like there is for the addicted one, right?
Mhm. Yeah, there is, and we try to bridge that. So sometimes with our spouses, we do the same trauma profile. We want to see their history. The interesting thing about trauma reenactment is that both the addict and the codependent are oftentimes acting out of earlier trauma. And so for both partners, then we want to do trauma recovery so that, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past, why is it that young girls that are molested end up being highly sexually active? So sometimes the adaptive part of that is that they're in that trauma reenactment, they're trying to gain control. The maladaptive part of that is that they repeat that place of being victimized. So oftentimes trauma repeats itself in that addictive cycle, and we want to not only help in the addict's world, but we want to help in that trauma recovery underneath there so that there can be a real sense of wholeness that develops in that person.
Absolutely. Yeah, so much wisdom here. Anything else that I haven't led you towards? Anything on your mind that you wanted to communicate, articulate, coming towards the end of landing this here?
I was kind of looking through a little bit of my notes I have in front of me here. So we, one of the things that we do is we also, at some point, would break some soul ties between the addict and the self. Because the person has really empowered the addiction part of them to be in control. And the self under here doesn't feel in control, but likes the hiding in that process. So we actually, through looking at the trauma history, how we can actually really take that layer off of the person. And we also look in that whole spiritual realm of where have there been open doors to negative spiritual activity, because a lot of people, when they stop using, they find that they're experiencing a lot of spiritual negativity. So we could say, well, yeah, because you're playing in the playground of the enemy, so you can't dictate how the enemy plays when you've opened that door. So we want to be able for that person to have a sozo as well that just really works on this, they're reconnecting their life with the Lord in a greater way.
That's great. I love that. So important. So if anybody's on this moment hearing you and they're saying, well, I want to get free, how would they approach resources, whether they're general or whether they're resources that you specifically offer?
So I'm available for a consultation. It's a half-hour consultation. If they fill out all the paperwork, I do a sexual dependency screening. I do an alcohol dependency screening. I do a trauma screening. And then I would talk with them about what their hope is and what I kind of see we could help with based on those screenings. So they can go to shastabluesky.org And
Okay.
there's a link on there to Transformation Center to fill out an application for a consultation with me. And then it's just $25 for 30 minutes. And we just kind of go over what's happening. And then we decide whether they're a candidate for our program or we would make referrals for them.
Great. It's excellent. So ShastaBlueSky.org.
Mhm.
Yeah, again, thanks so much for your time, Yvonne. Thank you for the work you're doing.
You're welcome, Lance.
Really,
Always good to see
really, really good to hear this. That's so fascinating to me. Very, very interesting process. And it, it looks like, I mean, I've done very limited research, but it just looks like addiction is it's a massive issue in the world, let alone our nation. And so being able to unpack this stuff just feels really important. And thanks for what you're doing. I think with that, I'm going to say goodbye, unless you had anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, I'll just say there's always hope.
Thank you. Thanks so
All
much.
right. Bye, Lance.
And
Good seeing
thanks
you.
for joining us, guys. We'll see you next time.
All righty. Bye-bye.